Understanding China has become more difficult than ever, yet also more important than ever. Hardening geopolitics has made travel to China more difficult, but not impossible. Join me, Scott Kennedy, for an on-the-ground look at China, for conversations with people shaping China and scholars exploring the country firsthand. What makes China tick? Where is the country going? How should the U.S. respond to the China challenge? We'll dive into all this and much more on this podcast. Welcome to China Field Notes. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this edition of China Field Notes. I'm Scott Kennedy. It's great to be back with you all again. For anybody who is watching current events in the world, you know that U.S. China relations are at a critical juncture and that they have gone up, they have gone down, they have gone sideways. And you also know that China's economy is a mixed bag of super duper cool technologies that are being created, as well as a country that is facing some significant structural challenges that's growing slower compared to years past. Folks have heard China's overall population has been declining. There's challenges with consumption and lots of challenges, but a mixed bag. We're all sitting over here outside China, trying to figure out what's going on. And the purpose of China Field Notes is to get perspectives from those on the inside who are living in China or travel there frequently, and to understand U.S.-China relations, China's economy, where it's going. We could have no better guest than today's guest, Han Lin. And let me first introduce Han Lin, and then we will have a fantastic conversation. Han Lin is the China Managing Director for the Asia Group, where he leads the firm's China operations from its Shanghai office. I think folks know the Asia Group's headquarters are here in Washington, D.C. Han also serves as an associate professor of practice in finance at NYU Shanghai, where he teaches courses on global finance and markets. And previously, Han was a deputy general manager at Wells Fargo in China, where he held key governance and risk management responsibilities as a member of the Asia-Pacific Governance Committee and interim China country manager. He also led China corporate banking business, advised multinational clients on cross-border finance and U.S.-China strategic opportunities. In addition, Han has been extremely active with the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, where he currently serves as chair of their Financial Services Committee, and he previously was on their board of governors. And in fact, the conversation that we're having today on Friday, the 19th of September, he and I are both in the Washington, D.C. area, although not in the same room due to the way podcasts get recorded. But it is great to have Han Lin with us on China Field Notes.
Scott, thank you so much for letting me join today. It's a pleasure to see you.
Absolutely. And you really, of the people that I get a chance to talk to when I travel to China, provide some of the best insights and level setting that I get when I'm there. And so I thought it was really important that the rest of the world get to hear from you. And so I'm really excited about this conversation. I wanted to begin, if we could, Han, ask about one element of your biography that I did not just mention in the introduction, which is you served in the U.S. Marine Corps.
That's right.
Tell us about that experience and then explain to us who are listening how a U.S. Marine ends up living in China for 2 decades.
So I grew up in Michigan, and one day I was walking down the street and I saw my first U.S. Marine. He had gravitas, presence, and the dress blue uniform just looked fantastic. And I said to myself, I need that as well. Well, this was in 1990, so it was actually right before Desert Shield, Desert Storm. I thought things were going to be very peaceful at the time, signed up, went through quite a rigorous boot camp training, and then Desert Shield, Desert Storm occurred, and I found myself overseas. Now, the war actually in the Middle East ended fairly quickly, but I was out in Okinawa at the time for amphibious operations training and also stationed in Subic Naval Base in the Philippines at a period when the South China Sea was a much quieter period than it is today. But certainly I came out of it, number one, having a great sense of appreciation for the mission, for taking care of your team. And I have to say, especially in a period where I was watching a volcano destroy Subic Naval Base at the time of 1991, the Mount Pinatubo, I got an appreciation for the fragility of life and getting to have a fresh perspective that we're lucky. We're lucky in the time that we live in right now. And so I came out of that experience having a very deep interest in international affairs, and that's really continued on through my career, even at the Asia Group.
That's really impressive. So you served in the Marines. Really, if you just weren't on the street that one day, you may not have seen that gentleman who attracted you. And then you eventually ended up in finance and banking and back in China. Can you give us just sort of a brief thumbnail description of that travel?
Sure. So after my time in the military, I spent actually a few years at GE, a multinational corporation during the Jack Welch days, and another few years living in Ukraine from 1998 to 2001. Also, a very different time when things were much quieter than it is today. But really, I realized I needed to be overseas, but I also needed some specific skills. And so I happened to be a graduate of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, or SITE, in Washington, D.C.
Woohoo!
Exactly, fellow alumni.
Yes.
And I realized, well, if I was going to focus on the international side, maybe finance might be a way to express that interest. I ended up in banking, went through a management training program of a bank then called Wachovia Bank, and I was immediately sent out on assignment for essentially a 2 year expat assignment in Beijing and Shanghai that literally extended to 20 years as of this year.
Isn't it amazing how you think you're going to do something very briefly and then 2 decades later, look where you are? It's amazing how life has those kind of changes. I want to ask about one other little small footnote on your bio, and that's just your name, Han Shen Lin. And because I interact with a lot of PRC colleagues, and they typically have their surname first and then their given name, and their given name is typically two parts, two characters put together. And when we write it in English, we put those two together, and the second part is lowercase. And for those of us that study Chinese and learn how to speak it, that's often how we encounter people's Chinese names. But Han Shenlin, you separate all three separately, and you've got your given name first. Could you give us a little education about names?
So you actually bring up a good point. For most PRC nationals, their names are two characters. But the fact that my name is three characters, literally in Chinese, it's Ling, Han, Seng. So my last name being Lin, and my first name technically being Han Shen, that actually reflects the legacy of Taiwanese heritage. Where in Taiwan, for example, they still have many people with three character names.
I get it. And so you really still have just used the Western orientation of your name. And then because of Taiwan and other experiences, and having also lived in Taiwan, the way that they Romanize is different from the mainland as well. So that'll just help folks who are listening and following you down the road. All right. So let's dive in a little bit to your experience in China. So, you started at Wachovia, ended up at Wells Fargo, 20 years on. Wells Fargo's had its own ups and downs in addition to China. But, you've seen the arc of China's meteoric economic rise, but also a financial sector that has significant challenges. So, what are the highs and lows that you saw when you were working in finance? What did it teach you about US opportunities and obstacles in China's economy?
So, the legacy of banking and the history of foreign banks in China has been the journey of promise and then being hit by reality, the markets itself. But when I first joined in 2006 with Wachovia Bank, it was under a very specialized niche business called US dollar clearing. And so, in other words, China trades a lot with the world. But when it trades, you always have to choose what currency will you do the trade in? And of course, the dollar is the dominant global trade, investment, and reserve currency. So, in many ways, when we say US dollar clearing, it was providing the Chinese banking system access to the US dollar. So, that was really the general business that I started my China banking career in. But over time, from 2008 onwards, after the financial crisis, when Wells Fargo acquired Wachovia Bank, there was a new mission. There was a mission that, in addition to providing Chinese banks access to the dollar, that in fact Wells Fargo would help follow US multinational clients into China and provide them onshore banking services. In other words, instead of just doing US dollar cross border clearing, to try to provide multinationals on the ground renminbi financing, renminbi advisory, maybe renminbi related retail banking. That was the aspiration, at least, but it turned out to be a lot tougher than people expected.
It did. I think a lot of folks who look at China as 1.4 billion customers and start thinking dollar signs or renminbi signs, and then they learn that it's a challenge and you've got regulators to deal with, you've got competitors. In the case of finance, China has a huge financial system. It's mostly state dominated, mostly state owned banks. It does have a stock market and bond market and other types of securities, but it's largely a banking system. It has a closed capital account, so it's hard for money to go in and out without approval. And China's banks, maybe smaller banks, will face financial problems and go under. But China's giant banks, the Industrial Commercial Bank of China, Bank of China, Agricultural Bank of China, they're not going anywhere, most likely. So, what is that for an American bank operating in China? What is that particular industry environment like?
So, one of the things you learn very quickly is when you talk to all of the foreign banks operating in China, it's pretty much impossible to take away much share from the domestic Chinese banks. And so, when you figure out what your strategy is going to be, you realize that the safest place is to focus on the cross border space. For example, foreign multinationals coming into China looking to invest, or Chinese companies looking to go outbound into the world. Where foreign banks can have an advantage competitively is in the cross border activities of, let's say, mergers and acquisitions, or cross border trade financing, or even foreign exchange related services. Because the local Chinese banks are so dominant that there really isn't much competitive advantage trying to target the local Chinese enterprises, because oftentimes foreign banks will ask themselves this question: what could we possibly know about China risk that the Chinese banks wouldn't have a better understanding of? And so, therefore, you focus on what you're good at, which is really looking at the cross border geopolitical sphere and where the opportunities are from there.
So finding that niche and trying to exploit that. And has that been a useful niche for banks? It's not the whole market. It's not domestic renminbi business. You're not taking a lot of retail deposits from Chinese households, but operating in this cross-border space. How has that been for American banks?
It was initially a challenge at the time when China was less secure about its own financial system, particularly out of a concern that global banks might just vacuum up market share in the Chinese market. So, to give you a sense of how things were different, when we were first setting up our branch in China, out in Shanghai, there were a number of rules in place that would sound ridiculous today. For example, if you set up a branch in China, you had to do US dollar loans only in China for a 3-year period before you were allowed to do renminbi loans in China. Now, let's look at the flip side. Let's look at if a Chinese bank came to the US. That would be the equivalent of telling the Chinese bank, if you come to the US, you have to do renminbi business for 3 years in China, prove profitability before you're qualified to do US dollar business in China. Now, of course, that would sound unbelievable, because for a Chinese bank, if the US does business in dollars, why would you be prohibited for 3 years if you set up your branch? There would be other regulations, like if you want to set up a branch in China in a rich city, you would have to set up one in a poor city as well. That would cut your return on investment in half immediately. So there'd be a lot of these different types of regulations, and oftentimes undocumented window guidance as well that would suggest policy risk is just as much of an issue as market risk. And oftentimes they would be one and the same. And so you would have to realize that in trying to manage and grow in China, you'd have to pay attention to a lot of idiosyncrasies about the Chinese market as much as you have to pay attention to US bank regulations as well. So, in other words, there was double the work. And that means you have to balance the bandwidth of your time very carefully.
This is the moment where we get to teach folks who are listening a little bit of Chinese. So I learned that the word window guidance is 窗口指导, but the type of guidance that you say you often hear people call 枪指指导, gun-like guidance. These aren't suggestions. These are sort of mandatory requirements. It's why I'm not in banking in China. So real challenges. And that's a really helpful window of the challenge. Of course, banking is a different industry than, say, retail or automotive or whatever, because you have this large financial system, state controlled, and hence they're giving just little bits and pieces of that market with still lots of window, quote unquote, guidance. Let me ask you about some more recent affairs in general. And this is also in the program where I remind everybody is that you're speaking in your personal capacity. You're not speaking for the Asia group or AmCham Shanghai or anybody else. But I wanted to ask you about this recent survey that AmCham Shanghai did of its members. And this is just amazing data that is collected and shared every year, and get your take on it. So the first has to do with business confidence. And if folks look at the survey, they will find that only 41% of the companies that were surveyed by AmCham Shanghai have an optimistic vision of the future looking out several years. And that is the lowest that it's been in a very, very long time. And if we go back to when it's reported here, it was 80% in 2017 at the very beginning of the first Trump administration. So it's basically cut in half. Why is optimism among American companies operating in China dropped so dramatically?
Right. So when we look at the survey, identifying all the key causes of why optimism has actually dropped, despite the fact that revenue has been picking up in the last 2 years, especially after the COVID period, there were really three key reasons that stood out. I think the first was geopolitical. Now, that sounds very abstract, but the key reason was this. Oftentimes, the China leadership team would want investment. And if they want to invest in China, they're going to need approval from their global head office. But if the global head office is reading the news on the US side suggesting US China relations are very volatile, then naturally they're going to want to delay that approval process. And as a result, the China team that is very much faced with local domestic competition, they get concerned. So that tied to the second issue of optimism, the pace of domestic competition. The fact that maybe they may not be as creative or innovative on the product side, but they're exceptionally ahead of the US in terms of process innovation, the ability to manufacture very quickly, cheaply, and on scale, and to be able to get these to market quickly utilizing a lot of AI capability, for example. And so that became a second concern that was very attention getting. And the third is just that the overall macro economy seems to have slowed down quite a bit. Now, sounds contradictory because when you listen to China, they aspire and will very likely reach their economic target of 5%. But the question is, if China's really growing, why doesn't it feel like it? And in large part, it's due to the fact that China's invested a lot in technology innovation, which means you don't need that many people working in factories. And therefore, the job employment prospects look weaker. And if people aren't employed, they're not likely going to consume either. And so a lot of our US businesses are actually targeting the consumer market, and they're very sensitive to the lack of optimism. So when we look at those top three figures, geopolitical, domestic competition getting stronger, and a slowing overall macro environment, that's really what's driven the reduction of optimism over this past year.
So let me see if I can probe just slightly further on this question, which would be different companies that are in different industries probably answered this question somewhat differently. And if we'd asked you to answer, you might have given a different answer. Let me see if I can make that a little bit more tangible. Let's say Wells Fargo comes to you and says, Han, here's 10 billion bucks. Do with it what you like in China or someplace else. And maybe it needs to be a different bank given that you used to work for them or something. But let's say we've got everything is above board or whatever, and you can do it. Where do you invest in China? Or do you go, I'm going to buy $10 billion in US treasuries instead?
It's a good question. So, generally, when, let's say, you were to give me a large amount of capital and you were going to say, invest it anywhere you want in the world. And if you've chosen a market, where do you want to zero in on? So, you're going to have at least two basic rules you want to follow. I think first, whatever project you're looking to invest in, the target is the return on capital should at least exceed the cost of capital. And once you've met that hurdle, then you look at all the other options that also meet that hurdle. And you're going to always have a checklist that'll help you kind of refine your decision process. Maybe among different countries around the world, you'll look at political stability, the size of the market. Does that country have pro growth policies in place? If you invest in that market, can you actually get your profits out? Is the supply chain efficient to save you time? Is the cost of financing locally going up or going down? And in many ways, we're starting to see that by those measurements and even more, China is starting to look more attractive. So let's say you decide to put a bit more money on the China side, then it very much focuses on where the government wants to see you to put your money as well. Because it does make a difference that when you're thinking about the direction of what policy preferences the government has, that can give you hints of where you're going to get your subsidies and tax incentives. So let me put it this way to make it clear. This year is very special. It's the end of the 14th five-year plan. It's the end of Made in China 2025, which has really been the last decade's roadmap of the key technologies China wants to have the commanding heights in. It's time for the new iteration of both of these plans. And it matters because depending on how the government decides what's an encouraged versus an accepted versus a discouraged industry, if you focus on the encouraged industries, that's where you're going to get the tax incentives, where all the subsidies will come in that would reduce your cost of capital. So you're going to get a hint from the government over the next several months to be announced next year, March, of where the government wants to see money put. And oftentimes investors will say it's better to bet with the government than against the government. So at least those would be some general framework ideas in place.
I can see why you're a good banker and also why you're a good professor listening to your comments. Let me ask a little bit more about what it's like to be a professor in China at NYU's campus there in Shanghai. So I think that you probably have both students from NYU who've come over to be in China, and you also have Chinese who are on the campus for NYU in Shanghai. And they may end up at New York at some point, but they may do their entire studies in Shanghai. And I'm just curious what it's like to teach both of those kinds of cohorts. If you have American students or those from NYU in New York and they get to China, what misperceptions do they come with? And when you're teaching to Chinese who are starting NYU in Shanghai, what are their biggest misperceptions of the United States?
So it's a great question. I teach primarily finance, both to graduate students, undergraduates, and also executive level as well. And when I see the US students coming through, there's always a sense of awe coming to Shanghai. I think the first observation is the city of Shanghai is very different than what their initial impressions were. When they look at the various skyscrapers, when they look at the landscapes, the sense of safety walking on the streets even, the perception is quite a shock. For the Chinese students who come, it is more open to creative discussion. Okay, in other words, coming from a more academic system in China where there may be one answer for every question, they're starting to come to NYU Shanghai realizing there could be multiple answers to a single question. And so to try to tap into the different understandings that both types of students have, they're actually roomed together. So for every Chinese student, they have to have a non-China passport student roommate with them. Now, that could be a US citizen, but it could also be students from around the world. So, in other words, both sides are benefiting from their experience from their respective home countries.
Well, that's really neat. When I was a student at the Hopkins Nanjing Center in the early 1990s, we had the same requirement and actually the same opportunity. And we learned as much from our roommates as we did from the professors. We learned a lot from both. And I think it's really important for that. It really brings things home. And that on the ground experience is irreplaceable. Let me ask a little bit about where you are right now while we're recording, because you're part of the AmCham Shanghai door knock delegation that's here. And again, you're just speaking in your personal capacity. You're not representing the chamber or any specific members. But since you are in Washington, I understand that people may suggest, when you come here, you need to learn how to talk in Washington speak about China. Of course, when we go to China, we need to understand all the things that you just said about how to be successful there. And when people are saying, you need to adapt to the Washington conversation on China, what do you think they're saying? But what do you think Washington still gets wrong or misunderstands about China that makes your trip here and talking with people valuable for them?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And first of all, Scott, also wanted to thank you and CSIS for hosting the AmCham delegation. It was a wonderful exchange of ideas, and we always deeply appreciate your hospitality. So, when the chamber comes through, there's really two objectives. Number one, to be able to share with the administration and with Capitol Hill what we're seeing on the ground in China. It is not to advocate a particular view, but to try to be fact based on the survey that we give to U.S. multinationals in China on the challenges and opportunities they face. So we're trying to anchor everything in fact first. But the second objective is to try to get a pulse of Washington, D.C.'s view of China so that we can bring it back to our membership out in China. So these are the two areas. But certainly the key message that we tried to convey in D.C. was this: that the China today is very different than the China of maybe 10 years ago. That issues such as intellectual property theft or the fact that China is closed and so forth, that things have progressed since then. And when we talk about innovation in particular, China is an innovation powerhouse, perhaps not the same in terms of product innovation, but certainly in the area of process innovation, and that there's something for American businesses to learn by being in China. And this is really the key points that we wanted to emphasize. First, if we're not learning from how China can compete in China, we're going to be competing against them outside of China. And second, the training that you get competing in China makes you more competitive. But if we were to exit out of China too early, then certainly other nations, be it Europeans or Japanese, would likely pick up our market share. And the third mission and key point we wanted to emphasize is this: we're very much aligned in support of the idea of reindustrialization in the US, and we want to be a partner in that. But there are certain things that could happen on the US side that would make it easier. More investment in infrastructure, such as the power grid, and of course, talent, workforce, whether it is through the education system or maybe through immigration. These would all make it more cost effective for US companies to want to support the reindustrialization of the US side. But certainly before that happens, we want to be able to compete well and to learn from as much as we can on the China side. So in that sense, exiting out of China before it's appropriate to do so, I think there's a lot to learn by US businesses still staying in China.
That's super helpful. I think what I take from that summary is the importance of being fact based and sharing your experiences so that people have a picture of China as it is, not as it was or as they hope it would be. And I think the second thing that I hear you saying is that there are a whole variety of costs besides just profitability if American companies aren't on the ground in China. And so the US policy community should take that into account when they're deciding what to do. They may end up deciding that they want to take things in a different way, but they need to know what the trade-offs are. And I think I hear that's what you're saying. Which brings us to the final question of our conversation, which has to do with leadership symmetry. Presidents Trump and Xi may meet very soon in person, either on the sidelines of APEC or in China. We're not exactly sure when they will meet, but it's likely at some point before too long that they will. There's been a lot of reporting about the possibility of a deal on certain type of products or on tariffs or other elements of the relationship. I'd just be curious about, given that you've spent so much time in China, you're very familiar with both sides, with business and with policy debates. Just if you would put on another hat and give your suggestions for what kind of issues or problems should be part of some sort of deal or common statement between the two governments. What are issues that can't be resolved or that should be put to the side for a while, or that would be problematic if they're addressed in a certain way. So here I'm asking you to go from fact-based analyst to policy advocate for what you think would make sort of the most rational sense for addressing a lot of the challenges the two countries face.
Yeah, so oftentimes when I feel like I've had a rough day and I'm tired and I want to pick myself up, I'll remind myself, as bad as I think it is, things could be worse. And that could very well be how you describe the US China relationship. So when you look at all the different types of scenarios that could play out, there could be overseas investment restrictions to each other's market. We've seen that play out. Worse could be the ongoing tariff war. Worse than that could be all-purpose technology denial from the US to China, for example. And then we could have a worse scenario, a currency war on top of that. Maybe a financial war involving financial sanctions, ultimately to a military war. So you've got this spectrum of different types of scenarios that could play out. But I take comfort in the fact that both sides are at least talking to each other. They're trying to engage and perhaps prevent it from getting worse. But here was the interesting takeaway I kind of got from being in DC. I got the sense that there is Trump himself, and there is the administration. There are many voices that have a more hawkish view about China. And that in many ways, if there isn't any pragmatic path forward that Trump and Xi can agree to, and Trump steps aside, maybe that will mean there's going to be gaps that the administration, the hawkish voices, might try to fill in. And so that's something that we've been paying attention very carefully. But from a commercial standpoint, our role as companies is not to advocate policy either way. It's to hope that there are stable guardrails that tell us where we can and cannot operate in. And that sense of stability is what allows multinationals to be able to plan going forward. And so when we take a look at the Xi and Trump discussion going forward, yes, there may not be any grand deal, and there certainly doesn't seem to be expectation. But the very fact that they're talking to each other makes space for maybe more CODELs or congressional delegations to come and visit and understand each other. And certainly it gives more permission to the working level officials to actually deal with the technical details of how US and China will engage so that we have clear rules of what businesses can and cannot do. And that affects how we make decisions on whether to invest or not.
That is amazingly helpful. And I think you're right that there is a potential escalatory ladder that the two sides could go up, that if you think things are challenging now, just wait and they could be worse. But there's also potential for possibly managing the relationship and turning this very short-term ceasefire into something that has more clear, predictable guardrails that allow businesses and consumers to have more predictability about where they should be doing business and by what standards. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I just want to thank you in all the ways that you have helped the world, first for your military service and serving our country, for your time in business as a teacher and a professor, and for your role as well at AmCham Shanghai, and for encouraging a conversation between the US and China that's based on facts as opposed to fears and misunderstanding. And also, of course, thank you for joining China Field Notes. It's really been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure and a privilege, Scott. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thanks for listening to China Field Notes. Stay up to date with our latest releases by following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to great content. Until next time.